Keir Starmer said today we were in a world where everything has changed. He said that was due to President Putin's aggression against Ukraine, but that was 3 years ago. What's just changed is a force across the Atlantic, which Europeans are finding impossible to restrain. It was President Macron in the White House yesterday with President Trump. It'll be Keir Starmer in this seat on Thursday. Today's announcement looked like an effort to sweeten that very difficult encounter.
I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. Yeah. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so that we reach that level in 2027.
Labour MPs cheered that, but when the Prime Minister announced he was raiding the overseas aid budget to pay for the defence increases, it was greeted by silence.
But, Mr. Speaker, in the short term, it can only be funded through hard choices. And in this case, that means we will cut our spending on development assistance, moving from 0.5% of GNI today to 0.3% in 2027, fully funding our increased investment in defence.
It amounts to cutting Britain's aid budget by 40%, a long-cherished Labour priority culled. Charities were in shock. The Prime Minister said he had no choice.
That is not an announcement I am happy to make. We will do everything we can to return to a world where that is not the case and rebuild a capability on development.
Some felt this was a move not only triggered by Donald Trump's withdrawal of support for Europe's defence, but emulating his domestic choices too, and those of Reform UK leader Nigel Farage.
In July, Reform UK fought the election on a policy to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 and 3% of GDP after 2030, funded by a £6 billion saving in the aid budget. Are you Nigel Farage in disguise?
Nigel Farage didn't even turn up to the debate in Parliament today. Nigel Farage is fawning over Putin. That's not patriotism. That is not what working people need. What I've done is take the duty of Prime Minister seriously.
Having been over 50% of the country's GDP in the Second World War, UK defence spending came down during the Cold War and dipped again when the Berlin Wall came down. The government says it will now climb back up to 2.5% in 2 years' time. Right now, the top spenders as a percentage of GDP in NATO are Poland, the US and Estonia. Britain's current spending at 2.3% puts us further down the pack, but significantly above lower contributors like Italy.
I think in our heart of hearts, we've all known that this decision has been coming for 3 years, since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. The last few weeks have accelerated my thinking on when we needed to make this announcement.
You bet they have. Donald Trump's abrupt withdrawal of support for President Zelensky has triggered one particular and massive new potential cost for British defence: keeping the peace along a massive stretch of land if the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is frozen. Military figures estimate it could tie up 3 brigades.
It's about 20% of the full size of the British Army and around 50% of the field army, the one that can actually deploy overseas for combat operations. So once you add that up and NATO commitments in Estonia, there's not really much else that you can do from a land forces perspective.
So when you look at these numbers and those sorts of new responsibilities, you scratch your head and think, well, actually, percentage of GDP defence spending not far into the distant future is probably going to be upwards of 3, 4, 5.
Potentially, but also we've got to go that way with allies.
A NATO exercise in Romania a few days ago. The challenge of backfilling withdrawn US military forces in Europe was met by the aid budget today. But if, as many expect, this is just the beginning, where does the money come from next?
The numbers looked tight even before all of this recent debate about defence. If I was a government department that doesn't cover a key government priority or mission, I'd be very worried indeed. Even if I was the NHS, or even if I was the Department for Energy and Net Zero, I might still be a bit concerned because the world has changed and maybe the government's priorities will change at the same time.
It was Keir Starmer's message, wasn't it? It's the logic of what he said.
If we're spending more on defence, ultimately that will mean eventually higher taxes or lower spending on something else.
Thank you very much indeed.
Keir Starmer's still young government is yet again taking a different political shape, stirred by a phenomenal switch in America's willingness to protect others. 5 months since he met Donald Trump before the election without cameras in his New York Trump Tower apartment, Keir Starmer will on Thursday cast today's policy jewels at the president's feet and hope they catch his eye.
And Gary is with me now. Pretty sombre stuff today, wasn't it, from the Prime Minister?
It was. Keir Starmer senses that there is a security crisis here. Europe is being asked to police and protect its own neighbourhood in a way that it hasn't done since the Second World War. But also we are moving from an age, the post-war age of the Western Alliance, to an age of competing powers. He senses there is an enormous moment here, but in some ways, you were touching on this a second ago, his rhetoric slightly outstripped what he said, because he talked about the numbers, what we were going to have to do in defence, but he only hinted at what risks Britain might have to take, or its forces might have to take, in order to fulfil this enhanced role. And if there were to be British forces in a buffer zone between Ukraine and Russian-occupied Ukraine, they would effectively, potentially, be sort of swapping, as it were, blue berets for hard military hats every now and again. This would be an incredibly risky thing, but there's something else going on in all of this as well. There's a political crisis that Keir Starmer has talked about in Western countries like our own. He says that his government is almost the last roll of the dice to stop the advance of populism. Now, in the past, he's talked about how the way to deal with that is to deliver on public services. But what he did today, by going for the aid budget, was very interesting. What he's looked at is a graph. The opinion polls tell you absolutely stands out. If there's one thing you ask voters, what do they think is the priority in public spending that they'd be happiest to dispense with, it's overseas aid. And he's gone for that. This is not just a world in flux, but a party, a government in flux as well.
Fascinating. Gary, thanks very much indeed. Well, Defence Minister Luke Pollard joins me now from the Latvian capital, Riga. Luke Pollard, thank you very much for coming on the programme. You heard Gary just now. In this really rather important and very sombre announcement the Prime Minister made today, was he led by the opinion polls regarding foreign aid, but also by Donald Trump and the imminent visit to the White House?
Well, it's certainly true that we're in a once-in-a-generation moment, and that requires us to bring forward some of the decisions that we were planning to make. We have in our manifesto a commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence. We've now brought that forward, so by April 2027, we'll be spending £13.4 billion extra in cash terms on defence than we are today. That's a proportionate, prudent a response to the fact that we live in more dangerous and uncertain times, and that we can see the aggression that Russia continues to display, not just to our friends in Ukraine, but in sending Russian spy ships to loiter over UK critical national infrastructure, as they did at the end of last year, and the continuing cyber attacks on the United Kingdom and our allies as well. So we're in difficult times. This is a tough decision about where the spending should come from, but it's absolutely right that we make those decisions to keep the country safe in these toughened times.
But is it enough, given the seriousness of the situation, the sombre nature of the Prime Minister's tone today? I mean, he was almost preparing the country for war, it sounded like. Is it enough to just increase defence spending by 0.2% in the next 2 years?
Well, the increase in defence spending to 2.5% is not the only thing that this government is doing. The Strategic Defence Review, the deepest and most considered review of UK armed forces in a generation, will be published in the spring, and that will set out what capabilities we need. So it's not just about how much we spend, and we now know we'll be spending more on defence, it's what we're spending it on. Learning the lessons of the war in Ukraine, making sure that we've got the capabilities we need as a nation to defend ourselves and our allies in these difficult times. That is why it's a comprehensive set of reforms that we're making in the Ministry of Defence, being more interoperable with our allies, stepping up our support for Ukraine, all happening at the same time.
Right. David Miliband, the head of the International Rescue Committee, said that this cut in foreign aid, that's where you're taking the money from, is disastrous, not just for the millions of people who will be affected by it, but also for Britain's image and soft power around the world. Could you have not found the money elsewhere?
I mean, this is a difficult decision. The Prime Minister has been clear about that to the House of Commons today. We are living in times where it's necessary for us to move our focus from soft power to hard power deterrence. And notwithstanding the changes that have been made today, we'll still be spending £9 billion a year on overseas aid by 2027. That will be focused on war zones and those areas that need the assistance the most. That includes countries in the Middle East and Africa, potentially Gaza as well, to make sure that we're getting the support to where it's needed. But
you've also broken sorry to interrupt, but you've also broken a manifesto promise. You said, with the money permitting, you would increase foreign aid to 0.7% of GDP. You've done the exact opposite. And I just wonder whether this is also you or the government pandering to Donald Trump, who the Prime Minister will visit in 2 days' time, because we know that Donald Trump doesn't like foreign aid. He slashed his own US aid budget practically down to nothing.
Well, as a government, we retain our commitment to increase the overseas aid support to 0.7% of GDP when the economic conditions allow. And that's something that the Prime Minister's reiterated in his statement earlier today. But it's certainly true that over the past 2 weeks in particular, but certainly the past 3 years, the world has fundamentally changed. And it's right that as a government that takes the defence of our nation seriously, that wants to keep Britain safe at home and secure abroad, that we take those decisions to increase defence spending. We've seen that decision already welcomed by President Trump's Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth today, describing it as a good move from an enduring ally. But we need to recognise, as the Prime Minister has said over recent weeks, that all of Europe needs to step up. That includes the United Kingdom, stepping up our support for Ukraine, but stepping up our own defence spending to make sure that we can look after ourselves, update our capabilities, update the deterrence. Because our Ministry of Defence budget, our armed forces, are there to deter a war in the first case, but defeat any aggressor if necessary.
Right, going to have to leave it there. Luke Pollard, thank you very much indeed. Now, it is too soon to say who will lose support and when, but aid groups are reacting to the news with alarm, fearful that the much-needed funding will be lost in places where it is needed most. Our health and social care editor, Victoria MacDonald, joins us now from Cape Town. Victoria.
Well, Matt, it is all in the timing, isn't it? Tomorrow, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, will arrive here in Cape Town where we are for a G20 meeting, and she is expected to talk to European counterparts about this defence spending. And as Gary said, the Prime Minister is about to go and meet with President Trump. The reaction, well, as you said yourself, David Miliband saying it's appalling. I've just had this press release from MSI Reproductive Choices. They said health systems around the world are at breaking point, human rights are being rolled back, and life-saving development programs have ground to a halt. It's the poorest people who will suffer, from the climate change impact of women in Senegal to the gender-based violence in Afghanistan. I mean, they're rolling in thick and fast, these quotes. We had another one from Bond, which is a network of international development agencies. They said this was short-sighted and appalling, and the global health partnerships asked the Prime Minister to reconsider. Now, we're here looking at the freeze, of the US funding freeze for things like HIV and AIDS. So this feels like a double whammy to the continent of Africa, where they're already having to deal with other cuts.
Victoria, thank you very much there for joining us from Cape Town. Well, I'm joined now by Taha Regazi, the co-CEO for ActionAid UK. Thank you very much for coming on the programme.
Thank you,
How much of a shock was this to you, and did you have any warning at all that this might come?
We had no warning, Matt, whatsoever, and right now we are in total disbelief. It is a reckless decision by a government that promised in its manifesto, it committed, as you said earlier in your programme, to supporting the fight against global poverty worldwide, and yet now it is going to put at risk the programme work of many organisations like ActionAid, and for us, what we know is that women and girls are always impacted first by these cuts. And we're talking about women and girls living in the most difficult circumstances.
So have you had to ring up, people in the field and say, I'm sorry, but the money's going to run out, you've got to shut things down, you're going to have to eventually come home, and the people that you have been helping, they're going to have to find help somewhere else?
Well, right now, I mean, we're just reacting to the news, but what I can tell you is that when a similar cut was made to this exact same budget, because this is always the budget that that the government seem to go for, that there was a program in Rwanda, a big piece of work, where women who'd survived sexual violence were being supported. That program was directly funded. It was going to be cut. We scrambled around to our supporters to try to raise more money. We managed to save it. But I believe that many people, like our incredible supporters and many other people in the British public, do not want to see this. They do not want to see this, and it's a false choice. You don't. In order to keep national security, we work with aid organisations. Our organisations on the ground, we do peace building work. That's what we do.
This is Britain's soft power, isn't it? Part of that. Yes. But then again, if you look at opinion polls, or the government's looking at opinion polls, foreign aid is always one of those things that people tend to say they're okay with being cut. But I just want to ask you a bigger question. Look what America's done, what Trump's done to USAID in the States. Shut down the biggest aid program on the planet, more or less overnight. The things that are happening here on a smaller level, are the political winds turning against aid?
Well, I think perhaps the political winds are turning against aid, but we just have to understand that national security is about people. It's about people's lives. It's not about big budgets. It's about people's lives. And I don't believe that people in this country want to see people's lives as political pawns in a game. And I don't think that people would agree that this is the best way to go about increasing military spend.
Tara Ghazi, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, the Prime Minister's announcement on defence spending is conveniently timed as he packs his bags for Washington, D.C. He's flying tomorrow afternoon. And in the last hour, it's been reported that Ukraine has agreed terms with the USA on a minerals deal in a bid to improve its own relationship with the Trump administration. Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, is at the White House now. Lindsay.
Ukrainian officials have told the Financial Times that they are now ready to sign this deal. But it's very different from the deal that Trump had initially proposed, which was basically everything in the ground of Ukraine belongs to us. This will be a wealth fund, 50% of future mineral wealth, including oil and gas. And I think that the Ukrainians now think that this might be rather to their advantage, because it ties America in to a future peaceful Ukrainian economy. Certainly President Putin in Russia isn't very happy. He was at a meeting of the Chemistry and New Minerals Department yesterday, and today he was saying, or the Russians were saying, we've got lots of rare earths, 650 million tons of it can be yours, America, if you want it. So I think the Ukrainians may feel that they're getting the better of this at the moment.
So, Lindsay, how do you think the Prime Minister will be received by Donald Trump in the White House on Thursday?
Well, certainly this announcement on defence spending helps. The Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, has put out a message saying it's a strong step by an enduring partner. So that will go down well. I think that what the Prime Minister will try and do is build on what President Macron was doing yesterday, which was to say, look, we are still working together on this. And he challenged President Trump, which was interesting, on European spending towards Ukraine, but he was also very friendly. And I think that that is very different from the Germans, the new German Chancellor, who has said that Europe should be becoming more independent from America step by step. I think the Prime Minister, like President Macron, will be saying, no, we are still together. We still have to work together.